I hope you all really enjoyed your lunch, that you warmed up a little bit during the break, and I hope that you're ready to be inspired again, because we have two people who have a very much experience, I think, in the blockchain and in the internet world, but have quite different views on the role that technology should play in society. And they're going to have a fireside chat, and I hope I only have to ask few questions to spark their discussion. So may I ask to the stage Marleen Stikker and Vinay Gupta. So welcome. I hope you really enjoyed the morning already. I know Vinay was a little bit cold, but I think he's doing better now, so that's good. Vinay, you were the man behind Mattereum and Ethereum, and you have a lot of experience in the blockchain world. And I was talking this morning to Rutger about the hot summer and a lot of discussion there was in the Netherlands about is blockchain really a hype or is it really a transformative technology for society. So what is your view on that?
So, first, I should say that Ethereum, my project managed, I helped with the release, but the original team had been working a year before I joined. Although I've gotten a reputation as if I was around from the beginning, I wasn't, came on board late. As for the outlook, I mean, people confuse the token price with the value, right? The token prices have bounced around in crazy erratic ways for the entire history of Bitcoin and Ethereum and all the rest of this stuff. The general pattern is it goes up by a factor of 100 and then it falls by a factor of 10 and everybody says blockchain is dead, the world is over. And then after a while, people are like, wait, it's still here, people are still using it, there's still innovation, there's still a whole bunch of new ideas and really nothing else is happening. And then the price goes for another wander and everybody goes, oh, it's going to change the world, it's going to change the world. And then it goes up by another factor of 100 and then it crashes again and everybody goes, oh, it's over, it's over, it's over. And this is probably the 7th or 8th cycle of that we've seen. And basically, it's to be ignored.
Is it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's, you know, because if you look at the price graphs have always had these enormous run-ups and then crashes, and then another enormous run-up and then a crash, and then another enormous run-up and then a crash. It's just what hard-to-value new technologies do. Right? Hype, disillusionment, hype, disillusionment, hype, disillusionment, and then at some point, it's kind of everywhere and you don't really notice.
Yeah, like the internet. So that's a nice
internet,
bridge,
like
I think,
cards.
to Marleen, because you were one of the pioneers of the internet revolution in the 90s in the Netherlands, and you were just recently on Zomergasten, which is a very popular Dutch TV show where you kind of explained what you've seen happening with the internet since that time. So, and you seemed, I think, a little bit disappointed in what happened. So do you see parallels with the blockchain movement today, and what could we learn from what happened with the internet?
Yeah, I think back in 1994, 95, we had this the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace by Barlow. And this was like a story that since we now have the internet and cyberspace, we didn't need any national states anymore, we didn't need governance. So yes, something resonates with the blockchain
what you heard
community
this morning as well.
that says we don't need governance anymore, national states, we don't need. So there's like a sort of a belief that the technology in itself will be so disruptive that it will change everything. And I think also back in the 90s, I think this critical debate, and critical in the sense of being more precise, not negative, because critical in the sense, what does it really do, and in which context? In that moment, it was the TCP/IP protocol. Everybody was like, everybody could join it if it was an open protocol. So if you use it, that's why the internet expanded so fast. That's why it was possible to build a digital city and just hook up to the internet, and everybody who was part of the digital city could be part of the internet and the other way around. So this was the storyline at that moment.
Yeah.
And the idea was that we didn't need any central governance and that everything would be fine. And yeah, I believe, I think I have a good reason to be disappointed since nobody trusts the internet at the moment anymore. So the internet is broken in a lot of different ways. And yeah, it's also partly the naivety, how we engage with the technology, that it's not neutral, it's also creating new power structures. It's never been an anarchic network. Yeah, and I think also with the blockchain, we have to be as critical, also not being negative, but being more precise.
Yeah.
What do we really mean? In what context does it really make sense?
And
not making sweeping statements that we're going to change the whole world because we have blockchain.
Yeah, so we should learn from the internet and the development there and try not to fall in the same pitfalls again.
And the interesting thing is that at that moment in time, already in the beginning of the 90s, there was this debate where the critical Europeans were already raising flags and saying, well, this cyberspace is not independent, where the Silicon Valley still was sort of building up this narrative. Mm-hmm. So I think it's very, very wise, actually, from Europe to have this critical approach and really think hard in how we can apply it, in which context we can apply it, and not being naive about it.
Yeah, be prudent.
Yeah, prudence,
yeah. I would like to confront you both with a quote from yourselves before and ask you to reflect on that. And we're going to start with a quote from Vinay. I think you said it at the last blockchain hackathon in April. You said we all had to grow up. So let's have a look at the quote.
We got a choice to make about how we run this planet. I think it's very important that the human race becomes adult, and I think blockchain is an essential technology to facilitate that transformation.
So we have to grow up. So at least I remember you saying that, and it really came. I really remembered it. So what did you mean? Do we have to grow up? Does technology have to grow up, or have we been childish about technology until now, or have we been childish about the challenges that we're facing as humans?
So the way that I like to talk about this is to talk about the difference between software and hardware, right? We all have a phone. And the phones, generally speaking, run a lot of free software. In the case of Android, it's the whole operating system. In the case of iOS, it's large parts of it. And there's been a long-running campaign to do free software, right? We've all heard of the free software movement, open source, all the rest of this. We've all talked about freedom of cyberspace, independence of cyberspace, all the rest of this. These are very compelling narratives. When you drop down to the hardware level, it's an environmentally contaminating, destructive to produce, short shelf life piece of crap, which gets used for a few years and then thrown away because it's not made to be recycled, it's not made to be reused. They're often manufactured in ways which are intentionally designed to shorten the lifespan. The reason your phones all have such short batteries is because the battery degrades after 500 charges and leaves your phone impossible to use, so you throw it away. The older phones, when the manufacturers didn't do that, you could take the batteries out and you could put a new battery in and your phone was as good as new. It's designed in obsolescence. And every time you hate your phone because it runs out after 8 p.m., it's because they're trying to make sure that you have to buy a new phone in a year and a half. You pay every day for this price. But the real killer is the amount of human suffering which is also embedded in the telephone. It's the forced labor conditions in the places where they extract the minerals. It's the factories in China with the terrible suicide rates. All of the information about those facts is available. All that information is there, but what we don't do is we don't attach all that information and bind it to the object, right? When you buy the phone, at the end of the day, when you check your bank balance, your credit card statement, it ought to tell you spent, 700 euros on the phone, and it involved, 36 days of forced labor and 725 tons of carbon and 100,000 gallons worth of water for the cleanup. And all of that information should be on the same balance sheet.
And you say we could have known that information, just that we kind of don't want to know and just...
And this is what I mean about becoming adult, right? We have to take responsibility for our actions and our impacts overall. We have all the information. We need to start accounting for that stuff in the same way we do for money. And the logical technology to do that with at this point in history is the blockchain. You use it to make it transparent to people what the cost of our living actually is. And most of that cost is buried in international trade and it's buried in environmental damage. We pull the information from hidden behind the curtain of capitalism, behind the advertising. We pull that information to where we can see it and it will inevitably change our behaviors.
So you're trying to change the behavior. I think Marleen tried to change the phone.
Yeah, that's very good as an example because we did research if it's possible to make a fair phone.
Yes, yes.
And then we start, so it's a spin-off from the Waag, from our research.
Oh, I didn't know Fairphone was you
yeah.
guys. Fairphone is fantastic.
Yeah. And if you look into what the challenge there is I absolutely believe that in certain aspects of the whole chain, blockchain can help. but it's a lot of macro politics. There's a lot of war being financed by part of the minerals that are in the phone. It's a quite complex system. And so if you look at what Fairphone tries to do to interfere in this chain, is trying to make it transparent, trying to explain and to make it also a narrative that you don't want to have child labor in your pocket, as with fair chocolate, as with fair clothing. So yes, I believe it's part of it, but there's so much more to it. Convincing people, creating. If you want to have labor, changing the labor conditions in China in the factories, it's also convincing the labor organizations, not just the owner of the factory, because there's a sort of balance there. So there's a lot of different tissues and structures that you have to change. So if we want to mature and take responsibility for the future of our planet, we have to do so many things at the same time. And I absolutely believe that technology can help, but it can also destroy us. I mean, there's also a lot of fear for the artificial intelligence in the hands of the wrong people. So it's not, the artificial intelligence itself can also be a big threat to society.
I think that's interesting that you think technology could also be here to destroy us, and I think Vinay is actually seeing technology as a way to give people incentives and to steer them in the right direction. I think you once said laissez-faire didn't work, so let's try something else.
Yes, I mean, the tricky part about this is that we're a very, very destructive species, right? I mean, we've been that way from the beginning. Every time human beings colonize a new continent, you immediately get an enormous die-off on whatever it is that's good to eat, and they burn down most of the forests. And the cultures that we think of, as living in harmony with nature, initially went through very destructive phases, then they matured into a kind of steady-state condition relative to nature. If we think of ourselves as being a destructive species that needs rules, that needs boundaries, that needs accountability, that needs responsibility, that needs limits, I think it's much more likely that we can build a world that works than if we think that we are a kind of peaceful and friendly species that just kind of accidentally trashes everything that it touches, right? And our models of human nature are really important, right? If we think of ourselves as being predatory apes that have managed to make a kind of halfway decent society, it's much easier for us to take responsibility for the places where our society is still not half decent. But if we think of ourselves as being kind of descended angels, well, we've all got, our hearts are always in the right place, and, yes, terrible things happen, but we're not really responsible for them, then where do the problems come from? Everybody's pointing the finger at everybody else. So my feeling is that the lesson from history is we're kind of a difficult, nasty species. We can organize society in a way which rises us above that biological base and gives us a utopian potential, but it has to be seen as an effort of will. It has to be seen as an effort of personal and social transformation, and it has to be maintained, and it has to be policed, and it has to be guarded, because when those things stop, we tend to slide back down to much worse conditions and much worse ways of treating each other.
It's so funny, because I have a totally different view on mankind. And I think it really starts there. But maybe we come together in the same solutions. But I believe people are generally cooperative, because it's almost a law of nature that the one who cooperates survives. We are social beings. We can survive if we are not being touched as babies. So we are very dependent on. And I believe that we are managing our societies on distrust, and therefore we get distrust. And it would be really different if we would start to design our systems on high trust, and not on competition, but on cooperation. So our markets are being defined by competition. Everybody competes, but underlying the principle is that we have to cooperate, otherwise we don't survive. So it depends where you start, and I totally agree with you that there's even this mathematical models where saying what is the best strategy with prisoner's dilemma and tit for tat, and then it's the best model, says computer, is to start with high trust, and if somebody is full play, you say tit for tat once, and then you go back to high trust, which is different from the point of view that we have distrust, and then we try to gain trust by policing. So maybe you come in the middle. I totally agree. We need rules, we need governance, we need accountability, we need all that. So I believe in the end, we can't just think it will happen by itself. But I would start with high trust.
But the problem that we have is all the people that are maintaining our standard of living, we're in very locked in, low trust relationships. Right? The people that actually make it possible for us to enjoy the standard of living that we have and the natural systems that we're exploiting, these people are being screwed.
Yeah,
right?
they are, absolutely.
So when we start talking about the high trust environment, if it's a high trust environment that rests on a low trust world, then we're in the position of the French aristocracy in Versailles. Right? We have a beautiful, beautiful refined space and everything is very wonderful, and just outside of the gate, that's where hell on earth starts.
Well, I think one of the reasons that one of the topics is the commonizing or commons or commoning, and I believe if we can bring this back in our thinking about what makes a household and economy work, then commons becomes a real, very important part of how we think about value creation. At the moment, everything is only defined by capital and by the very extractive business models. So I totally believe in family businesses because they have to sustain their relationships longer. They are for long-term value creation. But the type of short-term value creation, quarterly figures, shareholders' value, is a very extractive model, which is at the moment almost ruling everything. All our technologies, but also our natural resources. So I think this rise of the commons might be also a possibility to get a more diverse idea of how we can create value. And I think projects like Fairphone, but also a lot of different other, like a lot of the open source, open hardware movement is in the same space.
Well, I mean, I think we've seen a very clear example of the victory of the commons in the free software movement. 70% of the phones, most of the internet. On one hand, it hasn't been economically successful in that, Richard Stallman, who originated that movement, estimates that they lost $1 trillion of value out of the commons to the dot-coms because there were bugs in the licenses that the software was released under that didn't allow them to enforce the license against software as a service companies. So the software as a service companies all built their technology on top of free software, but they weren't compelled to give away the software that they were servicing users with because it wasn't covered by the license terms. And Stallman says if GPL v2 hadn't had that bug, instead of having $100 billion in the free software ecosystem, it would be closer to $1 trillion. He's convinced that 90% of the value leaked out of that bug. And that still shows that even with a poorly maintained, poorly protected commons, you have enormous wealth creation. I don't see any reason that that shouldn't scale. The problem is always at the boundary of the commons. Right? How do we ensure that the things which are going to be governed by the commons are appropriately locked in and appropriately protected so that you don't get these kind of extractions? Because the history of the commons is that as soon as somebody figures out a way of stealing the commons from the commoners, they will do so. So to me, these look like problems of protection and they look like next generation labor unions. How do we build the protective structures for the commons so that when you do have a legal problem, when you do get invasion of the commons, you have the ability to marshal the legal resources, you have the ability to renegotiate, and you have the ability to protect the shared assets from privatization, predation, enclosure, and the rest of that history.
Yeah. So we have to think about the rules of engagement for the commons and don't go in it naively. I think as also Michael said this morning, and Dimitri did. And I think, Marleen, you talked about in Zomergasten the third way. Is this what you mean with, maybe we should look at your quote first?
Okay. Yeah. I just want to say there is this whole notion of public code, which means that it's not just open, but that you need an organizational structure, a sustainable structure around it. So I think we move into I just put it on GitHub and now I'm open, or I have open data and that's enough. We need to have a curation. We need to have a system that really supports and also of course, protects it. I totally agree.
Can we see Marleen's quote?
Als je nu een beetje kijkt naar wat we voor een technologieën grotendeels hebben, dan hebben we dus de Silicon Valley technologie, de Chinese versie. Dus de Silicon Valley gaat uit van het individu wat in staat gesteld moet worden om zijn eigen belangen na te streven. En China die heeft de staat en die zegt de staat gaat zorgen dat jij een goed mens bent.
Oh ja.
En dan zouden we het Europa, wij zouden eigenlijk moeten willen, en voor een deel kunnen we dat ook, denk ik, zeggen dat wij willen voor de gemeenschap het goede. Wij willen het sociale in die technologie zien.
Is that naive, or can we still accomplish this? Are we not too late already?
Well, I have these discussions a lot.
Yeah.
And I said, well, we were occupied by the Nazis, but we didn't say, well, just leave it by that. Maybe it's a very harsh comparison, but we're not going to say, well, this is it. It's not an option. We can just say, we will lose our sovereignty, we have no idea about our privacy, we're being part of an extractive model. And especially as Europe, this can't be the answer.
Mm-hmm.
So I think here, naivety could be good, in the sense that we start to actually also put our money where our mouth is. But it has also a vision, and that's what I try to say, is that we need this vision that Europe has something in its roots and its values. And since technology is not neutral, we can put this kind of values into the technology.
It's
and
kind
be
of
very explicit about it, not just think it will happen, but to be very explicit. So how is Europe going to spend its money on artificial intelligence? How is it going to spend its money on digital identity? Can we make, well, we have some solutions like Signal and Proton Mail and DuckDuckGo and Brave, and like that are good services on email, browsers, and so on. But they have, well, more ethical business models. So I think there is a huge possibility for Europe, also huge markets, because it will become more and more an advantage to have privacy by design, or to have this kind of values inside of the technology.
Yeah, the professor at the TU Delft who's working on responsible innovation once said to me, in China they have children too, so they will start worrying about the future of their children and might want to adopt these better products that are being made in...
I would say these are universal values. I'm not saying that they're specific for Europeans, but if you see it as a market, then this is a huge opportunity.
Yeah. And is it maybe also that we need the pillars of the French Revolution, the freedom and equality and fraternity, maybe we should reinvent them for this new digital era, because I think they were very much focused on the economy we had back then, and maybe it's time to reinvent them, or at least fill them again. Vinay, what's your take on that?
So the biggest change since those days is that at the time of the French Revolution, we didn't have the ability to destroy the planet, right? Humans were, I don't know, a tenth as many as they are now, far lower standard of living, no nuclear weapons, no global warming, all of these things were still to come. So I spent quite a lot of time with Asian religion, and all of the kind of old Hindu and Buddhist material comes from a period in which right action was defined by the way that we treat each other in a very close personal sense, because that was the only action that we were capable of. Now that we have this global reach and these global problems, I think there's a pressing need to redefine right action in a way that frames it against the existential risks that we face. And this to me is absolutely critical in terms of our understanding of the whole world that we're in and how everything fits together. We need to work backwards from the survival of the human race and the species that we carry with us on spaceship Earth, and everything has to be factored towards those goals. Because all the other goals that we have are contingent on human survival. If we go extinct, which we might, which we all know that we might, which has been a realistic problem since the nuclear bomb was invented and multiplied in the 1960s, we're 60 years into the age of extinction, where we ourselves are on the chopping block of history. So we have to work backwards from we don't go extinct. We have to work backwards from the biosphere survives. And then all of our other goals have to be contextualized within that. They have to be framed within that. They have to be managed within that. Because if we don't do that, then what we wind up doing is hemorrhaging energy into a whole bunch of, frankly, completely irrelevant side quests. We go off and we make our, whatever it is, our, organic dyed blue jeans, which have enormous amounts of press lavished on them. And actually it makes no difference at all to whether we make it or we don't. And because we don't have...
Do you feel like, is there a sense of urgency everywhere in society that we're almost going distinct? Because, I mean, you're saying it, and I see Marleen nodding, but I think most people in the Netherlands and in Europe think, I don't know what this man is talking about because we're doing fine.
Yeah, precisely, right? And the thing is that if you look at the climate scientists, they're all freaking out. If you look at the people working on existential risk, they're all freaking out. If you look at the people looking at, say, pandemic flu, they're all freaking out, right? Normally, when you look at a risky thing, the more people know, the less afraid they are. Like vaccines. Oh, vaccines are so scary. You talk to people that know about vaccines, they're like, come on, you're more likely to die from a paper cut. Get over it, right? When you look at things like global warming, when you look at things like pandemics, when you look at things like nuclear policy, the people that know more are more afraid, right?
Okay.
And the risks where more knowledge equals more fear are the risks that we really need to pay attention to. So we're in a position where we need a global mass mobilization to take these risks seriously and to do something about them. This is also true for mass surveillance and the political risks that are embodied in mass surveillance. These things are real existential crises. But because we have this kind of nice thick layer of media kind of pulled over us like a warm blanket, reassuring us that the little fears should be taken seriously and the big fears should never be thought about, we're in a position where we're kind of sitting ducks for history. We're exactly the generation that somebody will look back in 70 years and say, but didn't they know?
And what did they do?
What did they do, right? Why didn't they act? So, you know, cutting through that is what I see as being the best possible outcome of the blockchain revolution. It's the possibility that you get absolute clarity about what it is that's happening in society because the blockchain is the audit system for the entire society. It shows you how much your car burns. It shows you where your phone came from and what it was made of. It shows you, you know, what it is that your neighbors are doing with their green solar panels on their roof and does all that work or not. Oh, I don't know. Have you checked their energy audit? So I think that the idea is that we could bring a lot of transparency to the position as a way of fighting back the mythology that traps us in inaction at a time that should be filled with unprecedented global dynamism and cooperation.
But do you trust technology more than you trust humans then? Is that...
I don't trust either technology or humans, right? The technology always serves human agendas, and the humans will get away with anything you'll let them get away with, right? So what we need is to use technology and society together to make sure that what we get is the best of human nature, not the worst of human nature. We've all seen what human beings are capable of, both at the high end and at the low end. And to me, technology is an assistant in the moral struggle for integrity.
Marleen.
Again, I would start somewhere else. I would start with the narrative. And I believe the narrative, I like a lot the the narrative of Kate Raworth with Donut Economics, which doesn't point fingers that we are bad actors and we are terrible and we are animals to each other and the planet.
That's why I don't think it works. It doesn't have a realistic model of human nature.
And what she's doing is saying we have to rethink economics, reclaim economics, and get away from this extractive, infinitive growth model. So you have to rethink growth. And if we rethink growth, that means that you can mature. So you don't have to go infinite, like exponential. These are always the graphs with technology. This like exponential growth. And this is sort of like a hidden narrative that everybody believes in. That's the best thing to happen. And she says, no, we not need exponential growth. We need maturing. Things have to mature. And this is also in our body. If we have exponential growth, then it's cancer. So we don't want to have cancer. So you have to rethink what growth is for our societies. So I think we have to rethink our economics. And that means that all the economic models that we have are inside of politics, inside of how we measure our success, inside of how we define if this needs to have attention or gets capital. So she makes this donut as the planetary boundaries and also the social foundation. And if you take these measurements, and I think we have more or less understanding what we need to do. Not everybody is, I totally agree that not everybody believes that, but there are enough people that know and have enough knowledge. So it is also a political movement. It is a new type of politics because it's not either liberal or left or right. It's very pragmatic as well. It's very pragmatic. How are we going to survive the coming 20 years? Because if we don't make these changes fast, we're getting out of control, and we are almost out of control. So yes, I would start with the narrative, so that people. I think we have to need a narrative that people can buy into and can also think that they have a role in this. So we say the technology will make you trustworthy. means that their existence is not of importance anymore. And I believe a lot in when people feel that they are needed, that makes them happy. It's not what you get, it's what you can give. So if we start to trust people again and start to say that they are part of this, and we believe in structures and social structures and also commoning as models in which people can take responsibility for their environment, we can build also upon on that. So I will see it always as something that is a combination. So if we have not a social movement and not reclaiming the models of economy and make them more sustainable and more maturing, that this technology will be in the hands of the same type of economy that we don't want to have. It will be extractive, it will be powered, elitist people that maybe they can buy their dig to go to Mars, but the rest is not going to go to Mars. So I believe the technology at the moment is too much elitist, too much in the hands of some know-it-alls, too much geeky, too smart people. Actually, that's our problem.
It's only a few people that understand and that are running with it.
There's a mystification going on as well. I mean, for me, if you look in all the different knowledge fields, there are people that are. We can also think, well, maybe we are extinct because we are not so important. Why should human species survive? Is there any reason for that?
Well, that's quite the existential question.
But the planet will survive. A sort of life form can survive. So some of these questions, I think, we have to address on a deeper level, and think: what is life? What is consciousness? What is intelligence? And maybe we have more in common with trees than we think. There's a lot of pre-assumptions for us to think that we are on the top of the chain. Yeah, for me, it would be really great if we can open up this debate and this discussion, all these kind of different questions. And then maybe we know what we want to survive of humanity. Maybe not all of it.
Okay, that's interesting. Let's have a look at the last quote. I think it's from Elon Musk, and it's about taking a prudent way forward.
What are you going to do, man? There's nothing, there's nothing you can do to stop certain terrible ideas from propagating.
Yeah. Anyway, I don't want to sound like things are too dark, because I think you kind of have to be optimistic about the future. There's no point in being pessimistic. It's just too negative.
It doesn't help.
It doesn't help, I think you want to be, my theory is you'd rather be optimistic. I think I'd rather be optimistic and wrong than pessimistic and right.
Right.
At least err on that side.
Right. Yeah.
Because if you're pessimistic, it's going to be miserable.
Yeah. Yeah, nobody wants to be around you anyway. If it's the end of the world, you're like, I fucking told you, bro.
Yeah.
The world's ending. Yeah. It is what it is for all.
Enjoy the journey.
You see the pupils? They're big. They definitely smoked something.
Okay.
Yeah, they have that on tape too.
So Vinay, doesn't help to be pessimistic. Better be optimistic.
Yeah, it does. Right? The people that we rely on to keep us safe, the people that plan for fires, for floods, right? Every dike in this country has a pessimistic side and an optimistic side. The optimistic side is all this great stuff you can do if the dike holds. The pessimistic side is the guy who's worrying about making sure that it does hold. Right? The optimism and the pessimism are two sides of the same thing. If we manage the risk, then we get the wonder. But consumer society makes an enormous amount of money from us by blinding us to downside risk and persuading us that tomorrow will never come. It's the same impulse that gets us to smoke cigarettes. It's the impulse that gets us to overextend on credit cards. Right? We are constantly encouraged to take foolish risks and to ignore the systemic risks of the societies we live in by people that profit directly from us being complacent. So, what I would say to people is, your ancestors, even going back to your grandparents' generation, were much more risk averse. They were much more cautious. They were much more alert. because the world was a little more dangerous and a little more difficult. And the world is still dangerous and difficult. It's just that capitalism has provided this enormous insulator, which gives us all the good side, and all the risky, difficult stuff is pushed off into developing world countries. Right? But it's an integrated system, and this is what the blockchain teaches us. It shows us where the risks are being taken, and it shows us where the prices are being paid. As we go forward and we get more and more technological power and more technological possibility, as we get this enormous expansion that comes from, for example, nanotech and biotechnology, as all of that opens up, what comes along with that is we're going to need a genuinely responsible global society that looks at these technologies and really does the analysis. What of this are we going to accept? What of this are we going to reject? What will we buy and what will we ban? And that's like our planetary immune system. It's the thing that basically surrounds us with a kind of protective layer to make sure that we don't get some kind of, dreadful infection from the future of some terrible technology or terrible idea that gives us the next global warming crisis or the next fascism.
Yeah.
We need a strong immune system that basically looks at the potential futures, assesses what's good and what's bad, and systematically weeds out the stuff which is bad and fosters the stuff which is good. And this is like a foreign policy, right? I used to say to people, the future is a foreign country, but it's also our single largest trading partner. And our foreign policy relative to the future is the critical asset, right? I mean, this entire meeting is basically a foreign policy meeting. The future is a foreign country. We're here to figure out what our diplomatic relationships with that foreign country should look like. We also need a defense policy. We need to make sure that we've got a way of ensuring that the bad futures don't invade the present, in the same way that what we have here is a meeting about finding the good futures and bringing them forward.
It's called everybody here today the Knights of the Future, and I think they have to protect the good stuff we have and fight for a good future. And I think we should let people slowly get back to work. Marleen,
yeah?
Yes.
Well, I totally agree. It is about the future as a foreign land, but we also can act now. There's a lot of things we can do in the moment. And what I see is that, for example, cities are taking really a good position. Barcelona, especially, but also cities as Amsterdam, Rotterdam, they are explicit in what their responsibility for these technologies are. So how is the public space? How are these technologies being implemented? How transparent is it? How surveillant is it? So I think what I see is a lot of actions in a direction.
Right direction.
That is showing that people don't see technology just as something that comes over as like an act of God, but as something that you constitute, that you are responsible for. You don't buy it off the shelf. You have to understand what is inside, what's in the black box, what is the algorithm. And I think this kind of more knowledgeable societies, politicians, younger people, I think this is really the starting point for getting more smart altogether, in understanding that in the technology there are routines, there are instructions, as if they were law. And this whole thing about code is law is a whole area of new research and new possibilities also to bring humanities and gamma science together with beta science. So the future is too important to leave to the engineers. So we have to come up with this sort of like collaborative effort and bringing new people on the table.
I think that's
as happens here.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful note to end this talk and to send people back to work. So thank you, Vinay. Thank you, Marleen, for inspiring us. I think you will be at drinks still discussing with each other your views on the world, because you have a lot in common, but also some very different views, which is interesting for us to hear. So thank you very much. And